The storm rolled down from the northern ridges like something alive, a wall of white and fury that erased distance and swallowed sound. Jake had seen bad weather in his 20 years on Frontier Station 7, but this one felt different, heavier, angrier, like it had intent. He stood behind his cabin, axe in hand, splitting the last of the frozen logs before the worst of it hit. Each swing was precise, practiced, but the wind kept rising, pushing against him harder with every passing minute. The sky above had already vanished into a swirling mass of ice and cloud, the light turning dull and lifeless. When the first real gust slammed into him, it nearly knocked him off his feet. The axe slipped in his grip, biting awkwardly into the wood as he staggered back. That was his signal. Out here, you didn't argue with storms. You respected them, or you didn't survive them. He grabbed what he could carry and forced his way toward the cabin, boots crunching over ice that hadn't been there minutes ago. By the time he reached the door, the wind was howling loud enough to drown out his own thoughts. He pushed inside and slammed it shut behind him, leaning his weight against it for a second as the storm battered the structure like it was testing its strength. The cabin held. It always did. Jake moved quickly, falling into routine, locking shutters, checking seals, feeding the stove until the fire burned strong and steady. Warmth spread through the room, pushing back the cold that had followed him inside. The familiar crackle of burning wood grounded him. This was his space, his control, his quiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee, letting the heat settle into his hands as he stood near the window, watching nothing but a blur of white beyond the glass. Out here, solitude wasn't a burden. It was a choice, a necessary one. The storm could rage all it wanted. He had everything he needed to wait it out. Then the knock came. Sharp, hard, deliberate. Jake froze, the cup halfway to his lips. For a second, he thought it might be debris, something thrown by the wind. But then it came again. Louder, urgent. No storm made a sound like that. His grip tightened slightly on the mug as every instinct sharpened at once. Nothing came to his cabin uninvited. Not out here. Not in weather like this. He set the cup down slowly and turned toward the door, his mind already running through possibilities he didn't like. The knock came a third time, stronger than before, carrying something unmistakable beneath it: desperation. Jake reached for the handle, knowing one thing for certain. Jake pulled the door open just enough to see, bracing it hard as the storm tried to rip it from his grip. Wind and ice exploded into the cabin, biting cold and blinding white, but the shapes beyond it held steady. 5 figures stood against the gale, tall and unmoving, their silhouettes cutting through the storm like it wasn't strong enough to touch them. For a fraction of a second, they looked unreal, like something carved out of the storm itself. Then one stepped forward, and the details sharpened. Feathers, sleek, layered, and rimmed with frost, clung to a frame built for speed and violence. Amber eyes locked onto his, focused and unflinching. Alien. Not just alien, warrior. The kind you didn't mistake twice. Shelter, the one in front said, her voice controlled despite the wind, each word clipped but clear. We pay. Jake took them in quickly, his mind working faster than his pulse. Combat gear. Coordinated stance. No panic in their posture, only urgency. Whatever they weren't helpless. Which meant if they were asking instead of forcing their way in, the storm had to be worse than it looked. He stepped back without another word and pulled the door wider. Get in before you freeze. They moved instantly, not scrambling, flowing. One after another, they slipped inside with controlled speed, bringing a rush of cold air and a sharp, unfamiliar scent that lingered even after Jake forced the door shut again. For a moment, the cabin felt too small, too full. Their presence pressed into the space, not aggressive, but undeniable. They were taller than him, every one of them, ranging from 6.5 feet to nearly 7. Their movements balanced and precise even as they adjusted to the lower ceiling. Warriors, no doubt about it. Without waiting, they spread out. One moved to the window, checking the shutters with quick, efficient movements. Another took position near the back wall, eyes scanning everything. The door, the layout, Jake himself. The others remained closer together, a loose formation that spoke of training and trust. Jake watched it all without reacting, his expression calm, controlled. Guests, he reminded himself. Dangerous ones, but still guests. Storm caught us between ridges, the leader said, stepping further into the light. Up close, the details were sharper. The subtle iridescence of her feathers, the faint scars along her arms, the intensity in her gaze that never quite softened. Our transport is grounded. We require temporary refuge. Jake nodded once, already turning toward the stove like this was routine. You've got it. Storm like this, you're not going anywhere for a while. He reached for extra mugs, hands steady out of habit. Coffee. That caught them off guard. A small shift. A flicker of something. Surprise, maybe. The leader's crest lifted just slightly. You offer freely, she asked. Jake shrugged, pouring water into the pot. You knocked. That's enough. Behind him, he heard their quiet voices. Low, layered, not meant for him. Assessment. Discussion. Decision. He set the mugs out, aware of every movement behind him. 5 alien warriors stood inside his cabin, watching him like something they didn't quite understand. And something about that felt far more dangerous than the storm outside. The cabin filled with a strange, layered quiet, the kind that wasn't silence at all, but awareness sharpened to a point. The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters and pressing against the walls, yet inside, every small sound seemed amplified. The soft crackle of the fire, the faint shift of feathers, the controlled rhythm of breathing that wasn't entirely human. Jake kept his focus on the stove, pouring water into the kettle with steady hands, letting routine anchor him while his attention stretched behind him. The warriors had removed parts of their outer gear, revealing more of their form in the firelight. Lean muscle, iridescent feathers catching flickers of orange and gold, movements precise even in stillness. They weren't just soldiers. They were hunters. And right now, they were watching him. He heard their voices then, low, layered, spoken in a language of clicks and tones that carried meaning beyond simple words. He didn't understand most of it, but he recognized the cadence. Assessment. Evaluation. The same way predators studied something new before deciding what it meant. Jake said nothing, giving them no reaction, no invitation beyond what he'd already offered. He poured the coffee into mugs one by one, letting the steam rise, letting the normalcy of the act settle into the room. Then one voice cut through the rest. I saw him first. This time, it was in standard, clear, direct. Jake didn't turn immediately, but the words landed hard, shifting the air in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Something in their tone changed, less observational, more personal. He could feel it, even without looking. The storm outside seemed distant now, replaced by a different kind of pressure building inside the cabin. Another voice responded, calm, controlled, carrying authority. We all saw him. My focus was first, the first voice insisted. Younger, sharper, certain. Jake finally turned, lifting a mug and stepping toward them, his expression neutral, unreadable. He handed the first cup to the leader, then moved down the line, offering the others the same quiet gesture of hospitality. When he reached the one who had spoken, the bronze and gold feathered huntress, she didn't take the mug right away. Her eyes were locked on him, unblinking, intense in a way that felt deliberate. He's mine, she said softly. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Jake held the mug out anyway, steady, unaffected. After a brief pause, she took it, her fingers brushing his for the slightest moment, controlled, intentional. The contact was brief, but not accidental. Behind her, one of the others made a soft sound, amusement or warning. The leader stepped forward slightly, her presence shifting the balance of the room again. Enough, she said, firm but not harsh. The younger one didn't argue, but she didn't look away either. Jake took a slow breath, letting it out evenly as he stepped back, creating space without retreating. He picked up his own mug and leaned lightly against the counter, meeting her gaze with calm steadiness. Whatever she thought she had claimed, he hadn't agreed to it, and that was about to matter. Jake let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but control. The words, he's mine, still lingered in the air, heavy with meaning he didn't need to fully understand to recognize the weight of. He didn't rush to respond, didn't react the way most would when faced with something that sounded like a claim. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, the simple act grounding the moment, pulling it back from whatever direction it was trying to go. The heat steadied him. Routine steadied him. And more importantly, it showed them something. He wasn't shaken. The bronze and gold huntress watched him closely, her gaze sharp, searching for something. Fear, submission, challenge. She found none of it. That, more than any reaction, seemed to unsettle her. "You heard me," she said, her voice lower now, not louder, but more focused. Less declaration, more test. Jake nodded once, like she had pointed out something obvious. "Yeah," he said calmly. "I heard you." No anger, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. That wasn't what she expected. A faint ripple moved through the others, subtle shifts of posture, slight changes in stance. They were watching him differently now, not just as something interesting, but as something unusual. "You do not respond," she pressed. Jake tilted his head slightly, meeting her eyes fully now. "I did," he replied. "I heard you." "That is not a response," she said. "It is when the statement doesn't apply to me," Jake answered. That landed. The room stilled, not tense, but sharp, focused. The leader stepped forward then, her presence cutting cleanly through the moment. "Among our kind," she said, her tone controlled. "Such a declaration carries weight." Jake nodded again, respecting the statement without yielding to it. "I figured," he said, "but I'm not your kind." The simplicity of that statement hit harder than any challenge could have. The bronze and gold huntress, Kira, he'd heard them call her, studied him with renewed intensity. Not offended, not angry, but recalculating. "You refuse the claim," she said. Jake exhaled lightly through his nose, almost amused. "No," he corrected. "I don't accept it. There's a difference." That distinction hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. Behind her, one of the others let out a soft, musical click. Interest, maybe even approval. The leader's crest lifted slightly, a sign Jake was beginning to understand. Kira took a small step closer, closing the distance by just enough to test the boundary again. "And if I insist?" she asked quietly. Jake didn't move back, didn't tense, didn't rise to the challenge. He just held her gaze, steady and unshaken. "Then you're insisting on something that isn't yours to decide," he said. No threat, no force, just truth. And for the first time since they had entered his cabin, the hunter hesitated. The hesitation didn't break Kira, it refined her. Jake saw it in the way her stance shifted, the sharp edge of certainty giving way to something more precise, more controlled. She didn't retreat. She adjusted. That, more than anything, told him exactly what kind of warrior she was. The dangerous ones weren't the ones who charged blindly. They were the ones who learned in real time. Around them, the others eased slightly, not relaxing, but stepping back from the brink of whatever that moment could have become. The leader, Vex, watched in silence, her presence steady, allowing the exchange to continue without interference. This wasn't conflict anymore. It was evaluation. Kira circled him slowly, not as a predator closing in, but as someone studying angles, patterns, possibilities. Jake didn't follow her movement with his eyes. He stayed where he was, leaning lightly against the counter, sipping his coffee like this was just another conversation. That lack of reaction drew her attention more than anything else. "You live alone," she said, stopping just off his right side. "Yeah." "For how long?" 15 years. A pause. Not disbelief, calculation. No pack, no mate, no support structure. Jake shrugged slightly. "Got trees. Got fire. Got what I need." "That is not what I asked." Jake glanced at her then, meeting her gaze briefly before looking away again. "It's the same answer." Something flickered across her expression. Confusion, maybe, or curiosity she hadn't expected to feel. "You choose this?" she asked. "I stay because I choose to," Jake replied. "That's the difference." Behind her, LRA let out a soft, thoughtful sound. "He defines survival differently," she murmured. Kira didn't respond to that. Her attention stayed on Jake, sharper now, but not aggressive. "Have you fought?" she asked. Jake smirked faintly. "Out here? You don't get a choice." "And you lived?" "So far." Again, not boasting, not challenging, just fact. Kira studied him more closely now, not measuring his strength in the way she might with another warrior, but trying to understand something less visible. "You do not display dominance," she said. Jake took another sip of coffee. "I don't need to." "Why?" He met her eyes again, steady and calm. "Because I'm not trying to prove anything to you." That answer hit differently. The room went quiet. Not tense, not sharp, but thoughtful. Even Vex shifted slightly, her gaze narrowing with interest rather than caution. Kira exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, deliberate. You are difficult to categorize. Jake smiled faintly. Happens. She tilted her head, studying him like she was looking at something entirely new. Not prey, not rival, something else. And for the first time since she had spoken the words, "He's mine," Kira wasn't trying to claim him anymore. She was trying to understand him. The air in the cabin had changed again, not sharp with tension, but dense with thought. The storm still raged beyond the walls, but it felt distant now, like a memory instead of a threat. Inside, the real shift was quieter. The huntresses were no longer positioning themselves around Jake as they had when they first entered. Their movements had slowed, their focus less about control and more about observation. It wasn't submission, Vin didn't submit, but it was something close to restraint. And that, Jake realized, was a choice. LRA was the one who broke the silence this time, her silver feathers catching the firelight as she leaned slightly forward. Among our kind, she said, her tone thoughtful, a claim is not ownership in the way you assume. It is intention, declaration of interest, the beginning of a process. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing that without interrupting. And that process, he asked, involves evaluation, she continued. Compatibility, strength, worth. Others may challenge the claim. The strongest outcome stands. Jake let out a quiet breath, setting his mug down on the table. So it's competition, he said. It is structure, Vex corrected calmly. Without it, conflict becomes chaos. Jake considered that for a moment, then pushed himself away from the counter, stepping more fully into the space between them. He wasn't closing distance aggressively, just making sure he wasn't on the edge of the conversation anymore. And where do I fit into that structure? He asked. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like I don't. That landed. The question shifted something again, not tension, but focus. The huntresses exchanged brief glances, silent communication passing between them faster than words. Kira remained still, her attention fixed entirely on Jake now, but there was no edge of claim in her posture anymore. You are the subject of the claim, LRA said. Jake shook his head slightly. That's exactly the problem, he replied. I'm not a subject. I'm a person. Silence followed. Not because they disagreed, but because the concept didn't fit cleanly into what they knew. Vex stepped forward, her presence grounding the moment again. You place yourself outside the structure, she observed. I place myself in my own, Jake said. Kira moved then, closing the distance between them, not as a challenge this time, but as something more deliberate. If the claim is not ownership, she said slowly, but intention, does that still hold meaning to you? Jake met her eyes, steady and clear. Intentions matter, he said, but they don't decide anything on their own. Not for me. And what does? She asked. Time, Jake answered. Choice. Getting to know someone before deciding they belong anywhere in your life. Kira absorbed that, her expression shifting, not confused, not resistant, but thoughtful in a way it hadn't been before. Behind her, LRA let out a soft, almost amused sound. He replaces instinct with process, she murmured. Jake shrugged slightly. I just make sure what I'm choosing is real. The storm howled outside, but inside, something quieter settled into place. The claim hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It wasn't something taken anymore. It was something that, for the first time, might actually have to be earned. The words lingered in the air long after Jake spoke them, not as a challenge, but as something heavier, something that demanded to be understood. The storm outside had begun to weaken, its violent edge dulling into a steady wind that no longer felt like it could tear the world apart. Inside the cabin, the shift was more profound. The huntresses were no longer circling him, no longer measuring him against instinct or hierarchy. They were listening. That, Jake realized, was the real turning point. Kira stood across from him, closer than before, but without the tension that had once defined her presence. Her posture had changed, not smaller, not weaker, but more controlled, deliberate. She wasn't trying to impose anything now. She was considering. In our world, she said slowly, choice is often shaped by strength. The strongest path is taken, whether or not it is questioned. Jake nodded once, understanding the logic even if he didn't agree with it. That works when everyone plays by the same rules, he replied. But I don't. A faint flicker of something passed through her eyes. Recognition. maybe even respect. You choose differently, she said. Yeah, Jake answered. And I expect that choice to be respected. Behind her, the others had gone quiet, their attention fixed on the exchange. Even Vex, who had held authority over the group from the moment they entered, did not interrupt. This wasn't her moment to lead. It was Kira's moment to learn. And if choice conflicts? Kira asked. Jake shrugged lightly. Then you talk. You figure it out. Or you walk away. Walk away, she repeated, as if testing the concept. Not everything has to be won, Jake said. Some things just aren't yours. That hit harder than anything else he had said so far. Not because it was forceful, but because it was absolute. Kira looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly shifting. The certainty that had once driven her, the instinct to claim, to decide, was still there, but it had been tempered, refined into something more thoughtful. I misjudged, she said finally. The admission was quiet, but it carried weight. For someone like her, it wasn't small. Jake shook his head slightly. You didn't know me, he said. That's not the same thing. She held his gaze, searching for any sign of mockery or superiority. There was none. Then I will know you, she said, not as a claim this time, but as a decision. Jake considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. That's how it starts, he said. Behind her, LRA let out a soft, approving trill. Progress, she murmured. Vex's crest lifted slightly, her sharp gaze moving between them. Understanding over instinct, she said. Rare. Jake picked up his mug again, the warmth grounding the moment. Not rare, he replied. Just takes more effort. The cabin settled into a new kind of quiet. Not empty, not tense, but steady. For the first time since the storm had begun, everything felt clear. Not decided, but finally, chosen. With the storm losing its bite, the cabin no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It felt shared. The fire burned steady, the light warm against walls that had seen years of solitude. And now, for the first time in a long while, conversation filled the space instead of silence. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The huntresses no longer stood like a unit ready for action. They settled, each choosing a place that wasn't about strategy, but comfort. It was unfamiliar for them, Jake could tell, but they adapted quickly. That was what made them dangerous, and now, what made them interesting. Jake moved around the cabin with practiced ease, pulling out extra rations and setting them on the table. It's not much, he said, but it'll do. LRA took one of the packs, opening it with careful curiosity before tasting it. Her silver feathers flickered faintly as she considered the flavor. Functional, she said first, then after a pause, and acceptable. Jake smirked. That's high praise out here. A soft ripple of amusement moved through the group, lighter than anything that had come before. Even Kira allowed a faint shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. She took a seat across from Jake, not looming, not circling, just present. That alone spoke volumes. You built this alone, she said, her voice no longer probing, but genuinely curious. Yeah, Jake replied. Took a while. Learned a lot the hard way. Why remain? The green-feathered huntress asked. You could return to structured civilization. Jake leaned back slightly, considering the question. Because out here, what I do matters directly, he said. If I mess up, I fix it. If I need something, I build it. No layers. No noise. Kira watched him closely, but there was no intensity in it now. Just focus. You define strength differently, she said. Jake shrugged. Strength's not just force. It's knowing when not to use it. That earned a subtle nod from Vex. Restraint is a discipline, she said. Few master it. Jake met her gaze briefly. Still working on it. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Not forced, not cautious, just natural. They spoke about survival, about the differences between structured systems and open environments, about the way instinct and choice shape decisions. The lines between them blurred, not in identity, but in understanding. Kira leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the table. You challenged me, she said. Not with force, but with perspective. Jake raised an eyebrow faintly. Didn't feel like a challenge. It was, she replied. Just not the kind I am used to. For a moment, they held each other's gaze. Not as hunter and subject, not as claim and resistance, but as equals. The storm outside continued to fade, the wind softening into something almost peaceful. Inside the cabin, something new had taken its place. Not tension, not curiosity, respect. And unlike a claim, that wasn't something that could be taken. It was something that had to grow. By the time the wind softened to a distant whisper, the cabin had settled into an easy rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar to Jake. The storm was no longer the center of attention. It had become background noise, a fading echo of something that had forced strangers together and, somehow, changed what they were to each other. The fire burned low but steady, casting warm light across faces that no longer carried the sharp edge of instinct. The huntresses had relaxed, not in vigilance, but in presence. They weren't guarding, assessing, or claiming anymore. They were simply there. Vex spoke first, her voice measured but no longer guarded. She described her homeworld, the towering peaks of the Talon systems, where the air thinned to nothing and only the strongest could hunt among the cliffs. She spoke of sky chases, where prey and predator both risked falling to their deaths, and of traditions passed through generations that shaped every decision they made. Her words carried weight, not just of experience, but of identity. LRA followed, adding her own perspective, less about strength, more about patience. She spoke of long hunts that required waiting, observation, and understanding the environment rather than overpowering it. Victory, she said softly, is not always taken. Sometimes it is allowed. Jake nodded at that, recognizing the philosophy immediately. The green-feathered huntress shared quieter things, rituals after the hunt, the importance of balance, the acknowledgement of life taken to sustain life. It wasn't brutality. It was structure, meaning. Jake listened, genuinely engaged, then offered his own stories in return. Not of battles or victories, but of survival in simpler terms. Repairing a broken wall in the middle of a blizzard, tracking a predator that had learned his routines, the time a massive tree bear had broken into his storage and refused to leave, forcing him into a week-long standoff that ended with mutual avoidance rather than dominance. That one earned laughter, real laughter, sharp and musical, filling the cabin in a way that felt alive. Kira listened more than she spoke, her earlier intensity replaced by quiet attention. When she did speak, it was measured. You live without a system, she said, yet you create your own structure. Jake shrugged lightly. Everyone does. Some people just don't realize it. She leaned back slightly, considering that. You chose uncertainty, she said. I chose honesty, Jake corrected. Uncertainty just comes with it. That seemed to resonate. Not immediately, but deeply. The hours passed without anyone noticing. Conversation flowed, not forced, not cautious, just natural. The differences between them didn't disappear, but they stopped being barriers. At some point, Jake realized something simple. He wasn't hosting them anymore. He was sharing space. And across from him, Kira met his eyes briefly, not with claim, not with challenge, but with understanding. Morning didn't arrive with drama. It came quietly, light filtering through thinning clouds as the storm finally released its grip on the land. The world beyond the cabin shifted from endless white chaos to something still and clean. Snow settled in soft layers across the trees and ground. Jake noticed it first, the absence of that constant roar more striking than any sound. He stood by the window for a moment, brushing frost aside and taking in the view. It's clear, he said simply. Behind him, the shift was immediate. The huntresses rose almost as one, instinct returning, not aggressive, not tense, but purposeful. Rest was over. Movement resumed. They gathered their gear with efficient precision, movements synchronized in a way that spoke of long training and deeper trust. But something was different now. The sharp, predatory edge that had filled the cabin when they first arrived was gone. What remained was controlled, aware, and changed. Jake stepped back from the window, giving them space as they prepared. He didn't rush them, didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was steady, comfortable in a way he hadn't expected. Vex approached first, adjusting the last piece of her gear before stopping in front of him. She extended her forearm in a firm, deliberate gesture. Jake met it without hesitation, clasping it in return. You offered shelter, she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. But you also offered perspective. That is not easily given. Jake shrugged lightly. Just conversation, he said. Vex's crest lifted slightly. For some, that is enough to change a path. One by one, The others moved toward the door, each offering a nod, a glance, or a brief acknowledgement. Small gestures, but meaningful. Then Kira stepped forward last. She didn't rush, didn't close the distance too quickly. She stopped a few steps from him, her posture steady, her gaze clear. No claim, no pressure. If I return, she said carefully, with time and intention, would you speak with me again? Jake met her eyes, seeing something real there now, something that hadn't existed when she first walked through his door. He considered it for a moment, not out of doubt, but because that was the point. Choice. Bring good coffee, he said finally, a faint smile touching his expression, and we'll see. A small shift of satisfaction crossed her features, controlled but unmistakable. I will bring the best I can find, she replied. Jake moved to the door and opened it, cold air rushing in again. But this time, it felt clean, not hostile. The world outside was quiet, bright, and open. They stepped out one by one, their figures cutting through the fresh snow as they moved toward the distant clearing where their transport would find them. Kira glanced back once, just for a moment, meeting his eyes again before turning away. Jake closed the door slowly, the cabin settling back into silence. It felt empty again, but not the same kind of empty. He poured himself another cup of coffee, standing in the quiet as the last traces of the storm faded from the world. Maybe, he thought, staring into the rising steam. Some doors weren't meant to stay closed forever.